I generally do these videos extemporaneously, but there's been enough misunderstanding and there's a lot of ground to cover, and I want to try to keep on track and keep on point. So I've pre-written this response. It should be noted up front that absence of strong objection on my part is not an indication of absence of strong feeling on the issue, but rather that most of what I would say in that vein has already been said, and said particularly well by that gay bloke. The one thing that I'd add along the lines that he expounds upon is the importance when we find ourselves in the position of seeing our position, the words we're using, the kinds of arguments that we make, very closely paralleling one that is produced from and reiterated within a particular political platform or campaign. It's very important that we start evaluating that message as it is coming out of our mouths, and hopefully before, on grounds of political expedience. Where did this kind of focus on trans come from? Why did the people who advocate it, and by advocated I mean present this very particular take on trans issues, why did they take an interest in it at all? At the risk of opening a new can of worms in a time when we've already opened enough of them that we will never want for fishing bait again, trans and any other non-binary gender model is a direct threat to rhetorical platforms built on presumption of the perpetuity of battle of the sexes. And this is not without precedent. When gays and lesbians were in a similar position of social vulnerability, they were the target of similar rhetoric. To paraphrase and appropriate something that you said in your video, trans people are just as able to defend themselves as any other group of people who have been shoved beyond the margins of mainstream perception and rejected by their supposed fringe allies as often as not. There remains loud and often hurtful debate about the legitimate inclusion of the T in LGBT, and the Q at the end is almost always omitted. This is not a symbolic quibble, but a reflection of real attitudes that inform real actions. Trans organizations are frequently barred from pride events, and are even protested by better established lesbian and gay rights activist groups. The scale of the response is in part proportioned, and the response on YouTube in this fracas is in part proportioned to the perspectives of other people. Again, you're not the only or loudest voice on this issue. You're not speaking from or to a vacuum, and there are some strange things going on YouTube right now regarding gender and gender politics as topics for debate. Part of the reaction that you're getting is people drawing lines and working out where the bounds of objectionability are. This is consensus building. Chaotic consensus building, but consensus building nonetheless. Changing gears, and this is more where I wanted to focus. The outsider experience, and when we're talking about trans or genderqueer or androgyne or what have you, we are talking about outsider experience. The outsider experience cultivates two properties within a person, in degrees largely contingent on the individual and the kind of support they have available: patience and anger. And those are not opposed qualities. It is entirely possible, and in fact quite common, for someone's experiences to make them very, very patient and at the same time load them with a heavy burden of anger. Whether we have or want to have influence has no bearing on whether or not we do. When operating outside our confident knowledge, we would do well to try to modulate our presentation accordingly. If we're seeking information, we should ask questions, rather than confidently repeating a myth to see what rebuttals we get. something that needs to be understood is that the majority of the opposition folk in the LGBTQ spectrum run into is social sanction, just opinions, and opinions held in varying degrees of conviction and acted upon with varying degrees of force. While it's easier to identify dramatic examples, most of the harm done to most of the people most of the time is done relatively quietly. A setback in legislature like a gay marriage ban can be devastating, but its direct legal impact is minuscule compared to the ripples it causes in attitudes, perceptions, the things that people do and say in small ways, and the accumulation of minutiae. Those minutiae are invisible to us when they are in the affirmative. We affirm our respect, our regard, and inclusion of each other thousands of times a day. They are as necessary, these gestures of inclusion, as necessary and unnoticed as every breath that fills our lungs with nitrogen, oxygen, and hydrogen instead of argon, chlorine, and freon. If you take a breath with a noticeable chlorine content, it arrests your attention. Whatever else you were focusing on shifts aside. The experience is too jarring to ignore, imprints itself on your senses and memory. If you've ever had serious chlorine poisoning, you can probably smell if someone has bleached a floor within the past 2 weeks. You're sensitized because the experience was an interruption of something you took for granted, because it was damaging and because it was rare. Attitudes on these issues and identities are a selective sort of chlorine in the air. They're smelt by some, inhaled by some, and are particularly poisonous to some. The problem is that this chlorine is so prevalent that few manage to pass a full day without a few deep breaths worth of it. The clear and easy breaths, the breaths that are not filled with poison, are the exception, not the rule. Those thousands of gestures of inclusion on which the included rely are not simply denied. They are flat out contradicted. I'm going to risk a gross generalization here, and one I fully expect to get a little bit of flack for, and that's fine because it is deserved. Although I hope that some will understand why I'm resorting to this generalization. The majority of the more inflamed rebuttals, as you've been pointing out, have not been from transgender, queer, androgynes, what have you. Note, not, with some noteworthy exceptions, from people so invested in these aspects of identity that they've put themselves at great pain in that investment. This is not to diminish the value of those voices, and as I said, there are quite a few important exceptions to that generalization. Other gendered, ambigendered, polygendered people who have expressed very, very strong opinions, in addition to trans, lesbians, gays, bisexuals. It's a very long list of terms, so you'll forgive me for cutting it off. What I want to draw your attention to, though, is the number of other gendered persons for whom it is an aspect of their daily lives who have responded relatively calmly. Now, I'm not referring to the gender is strange for everyone set, though those voices are appreciated, but rather to those who have found gender to be an issue sufficiently painful, important, and potentially liberating to make life changes around it. From what I see in the comments on these videos, there is a trend among said folk toward a calm, conciliatory position, and when there is objection, it is presented with the presumption that you are responsive to changing your perspective. Again, from a position of respect and reconciliation, more pleading than accusing. It would be easy to interpret that as support. and that would be a profound misunderstanding. Now, the dispelling of that misunderstanding is an opportunity, and one that I think you have the insight necessary to capitalize on. The muted outrage from that quarter is not an indication that the perspectives you've been conveying are correct, fair, or non-harmful. It is an indication that, for the people so speaking, and speaking with a conciliatory voice, hearing these kinds of perspectives is normal. Nothing special. It's not a slight or injury that stands above the others that accumulate daily. Those accustomed to being misunderstood have a lot of practice managing their own responses to misunderstanding. Those often shunned are practiced in mitigating the shunning. What you see, and have seen, in those quieter responses is not an indication of how flagrant your comments are or aren't, which honestly would be a trivial point. How flagrant your perspectives are or aren't is a revelation with very, very little use, very limited application. What is being indicated, however, is potentially far more useful and potentially perspective shifting. It's an indication of how frequently these more barbed sentiments are heard. It's an indication of how polished those conciliatory skills have had to become. Silly example. Very silly example. But we could do with a bit of silliness, I think. It doesn't bother me when I'm out in public and people stare at this. Does not bother me. Although most people seem to assume that it would. Seem to assume that this would enrage me. Seem to assume that if they don't pretend they're not looking, they risk drawing some kind of King Kong-esque pounding frenzy. Most of the time, the people staring are far more uncomfortable than I am. Not because the position of the starer is less comfortable than the position of being stared at, but because I've got a hell of a lot more practice being stared at than they have at staring. I just have more practice with the situation. Almost invariably, the tension will reach a point where some people start looking away, where some people will start nervously shifting back and forth, and someone will flat out ask a question. And at that point, I chuckle, and I launch into a very, very well-practiced explanation. And the tension dissolves. The people who were nervously shifting back and forth settle down. The people who were transitioning from staring into glaring tend to mellow out a little bit. With a couple of jokes at my own expense, a conciliatory attitude, a few laughs, and getting other people to laugh with me. I cease to be a threat, and more to the point, change the situation in such a way that they are not a threat to me. And only because I can only do that because I've got a lot of practice. And not to put too fine a point on it, practice that precedes this. Like I said, it's a silly example, but I think you get the point. When you see someone who is very, very good at from a position of relative weakness. And by weakness I mean